It started out innocently, as these things often do. A casual glance, a friendly conversation, and before long, the lines had begun to blur. I never intended for it to happen, but once the wheels were in motion, it felt impossible to stop. Jack, my husband, had always been a good man. We met in college, fell in love fast, and built a life together. Our relationship wasn't perfect, whose is, but we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Over time, though, something shifted. Jack became more absorbed in his work, the long hours at the office pulling him further and further away from me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. But the longer it went on, the more I felt myself slipping away from him. I first met Sarah at one of Jack's work events. She was his new secretary, fresh out of university and eager to prove herself. Jack had spoken about her in passing, mentioning how efficient and organized she was, and how she'd helped streamline his workload. I hadn't given her much thought at the time, just another employee in his ever-growing company. When we were introduced, Sarah greeted me with a warm smile, her green eyes sparkling under the dim lights of the event hall. She was friendly, open, and easy to talk to. I found myself relaxing in her company, enjoying the ease with which she navigated conversations. She was attentive, asking me about my life, my interests, and my relationship with Jack. It was refreshing to have someone take such an interest in me, especially when Jack had been so distant. As the night went on, I caught glimpses of Jack across the room, deep in conversation with his colleagues. He barely glanced my way. I didn't mind at first, but as the hours passed, a familiar pang of loneliness crept in. Sarah seemed to sense my mood shift and suggested we grab a drink at the bar. "I've been meaning to get to know you better," she said as we settled onto the bar stools. "Jack speaks so highly of you." I smiled, though it felt forced. "Does he?" I hadn't heard Jack talk about me like that in a long time. "Absolutely. He's always mentioning how strong and supportive you are. I think it's wonderful, the way you two have built such a solid relationship." Her words, though kind, felt like salt in a wound. I nodded, swirling the wine in my glass. "Thanks," I said quietly. "We've been through a lot together." We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. Sarah was engaging, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone in a long time. She had a way of making me feel seen, as though she truly cared about what I had to say. I couldn't help but be drawn to her warmth and sincerity. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I continued to cross paths. Sometimes it was at Jack's office, where I'd stop by for lunch, and other times it was at events or social gatherings. Each time, we'd find ourselves talking, and I began to look forward to those moments. She became a breath of fresh air in my otherwise stagnant routine. One afternoon, while Jack was buried in a meeting, Sarah and I sat in the lobby, waiting for him to finish. We talked about everything from books to travel, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. It felt so natural, so easy. As we were about to leave, Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? Just the two of us?" I paused, surprised by the invitation. But there was something about the way she asked, something in her eyes that made me curious. I agreed, and we made plans for the following week. Our coffee dates became a regular occurrence. At first, they were innocent enough, two friends chatting about life. But gradually, something shifted. Our conversations became deeper, more personal. We talked about our relationships, our insecurities, and the things that kept us up at night. I found myself confiding in her about Jack. I told her how distant he'd become, how lonely I felt in our marriage. She listened without judgment, offering words of comfort and understanding. She told me that she'd noticed how hard Jack worked and how it must be difficult for me to feel neglected. "You deserve to feel valued," she said one day, her voice soft but firm. "You deserve to have someone who makes you feel special." Her words lingered with me long after our coffee date ended. I couldn't stop thinking about them, about how much I missed feeling special, feeling important. Jack used to make me feel that way, but now it seemed like I was just an afterthought in his busy life. It was during one of those coffee dates that the first real spark ignited. We were sitting in a quiet corner of a small cafe, tucked away from the bustling streets outside. I don't remember what we were talking about, something trivial, I'm sure, but then Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. I looked up, meeting her gaze, and there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Something more than friendship. For a moment, I was frozen, unsure of what to do. But then she smiled, her fingers lingering on mine, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was intoxicating, that feeling of being wanted, of being seen. From that moment on, things between us changed. The innocent coffee dates turned into something more, something unspoken but undeniable. I found myself thinking about her constantly, craving the moments we spent together. There was a connection between us that I couldn't ignore, a pull that grew stronger with each passing day. I knew it was wrong. Jack was my husband, and I had made vows to him. But the more distant he became, the more I found myself drawn to Sarah. She filled a void that had been growing inside me for months, maybe even years. She made me feel alive again. It wasn't long before our meetings became more frequent, more intimate. We started sneaking away during the day, finding excuses to be alone together. Every time we met, the tension between us grew, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That line came one afternoon when we met at a quiet park, away from prying eyes. We sat on a bench, talking as we always did, but this time, the conversation felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared knowledge of what was about to happen. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, and before I knew what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if she was testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, and all the emotions I had been suppressing came flooding to the surface. In that moment, I didn't care about right or wrong. I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was how Sarah made me feel, alive, wanted, and important. It was the beginning of something I couldn't control. Something that would change everything. After that first kiss, everything changed. I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, replaying that moment over and over in my mind. The way her lips had felt against mine, the softness of her touch, it was intoxicating. It awakened something inside of me, something I hadn't realized was missing. Jack continued to be oblivious, wrapped up in his work, staying late at the office most nights and barely noticing my absence. In some ways, his distance made it easier. I didn't have to hide the guilt because I wasn't sure I even felt guilty. Not at first. I knew I should, but it was hard to feel regret when I was finally experiencing something that made me feel alive again. Sarah and I didn't talk about what had happened immediately. After that kiss in the park, we both pulled back, almost as if we were afraid to acknowledge what had occurred between us. But the tension between us was undeniable. Every time we met after that, there was a charge in the air, an unspoken connection that made even the most mundane moments feel electric. The next time we saw each other, we were back at the same cafe where everything had started. I was nervous, unsure of what to say or how to act, but Sarah was as calm and collected as always. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes warm and inviting, and it was like all the tension I had been feeling melted away. We sat in our usual spot, tucked away in the corner where we could talk without interruption. For a while, we kept the conversation light, discussing work, friends, and the little things that had happened in our daily lives. But beneath the surface, I could feel the weight of that kiss lingering between us, waiting to be addressed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah broke the silence. "We should talk about what happened," she said gently, her eyes searching mine. "About the kiss." I took a deep breath, unsure of how to respond. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to apologize, to explain it away as a mistake, but another part of me, the part that had been longing for connection, didn't want to take it back. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect it to happen, but I'm not sorry that it did. Sarah smiled softly, her hand reaching across the table to take mine. I'm not sorry either, she said. But I don't want to make things complicated for you. I know you're married, and I don't want to be the reason things get messy. Her words were kind, but they only heightened the turmoil I was feeling inside. She wasn't trying to pressure me, but the reality of my situation was becoming harder to ignore. Jack was still my husband. We had built a life together, and while things had been distant between us lately, there was still a part of me that loved him. But love wasn't always enough. At least, that's what I told myself. Jack had been so absent, so focused on his work, that I had started to feel like a ghost in our own home. With Sarah, I felt seen, wanted, and alive in a way I hadn't for a long time. Was it so wrong to crave that? To want more for myself? I don't know what I want, I confessed, squeezing Sarah's hand. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel different. I feel like I matter. You do matter, Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. You deserve to feel that way all the time. We sat in silence for a few moments, our hands still intertwined. I didn't know where things were headed, but I knew that I wasn't ready to let go of the connection we had. It wasn't just about the physical attraction, though that was undeniably there. It was about the way Sarah made me feel, valued, important, and like I was more than just someone's wife. After that conversation, things between us escalated. Our coffee dates turned into long afternoons spent together, away from the eyes of the world. We met in parks, quiet restaurants, and even the occasional hotel room, always careful to keep our relationship hidden from Jack and anyone else who might notice. The secrecy of it all added a layer of excitement, but it also weighed heavily on me at times. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that someone might recognize us or that Jack might catch on to what was happening. But Jack remained as distracted as ever, more focused on his growing business than on anything that was happening in our marriage. I told myself that what I was doing wasn't wrong. Jack had been neglecting me for months, maybe even years. I had tried to reach out to him, to make things work, but he had always been too busy, too distracted to notice my efforts. In some twisted way, I convinced myself that he had driven me to this, that if he had only paid more attention, I wouldn't have felt the need to seek comfort elsewhere. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that what I was doing would destroy him if he ever found out. Jack wasn't a bad man, he was just lost in his own world, and I had given up on trying to pull him out of it. Instead, I had chosen to build a new world for myself, one where I could feel alive again, even if it meant lying to the man I had promised to love forever. The guilt started to creep in slowly, at first just a whisper in the back of my mind, but soon it became louder, more insistent. I would lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep up the charade. How long could I lie to Jack's face, pretending that everything was fine while secretly sneaking around behind his back? But every time I thought about ending things with Sarah, the thought of going back to the way things were, back to the loneliness, the isolation, the feeling of being invisible in my own marriage, was too much to bear. Sarah had become my escape, my lifeline, and I wasn't ready to give that up. So, I continued to live in the shadows, hiding my affair from Jack while growing closer to Sarah with each passing day. And as much as I tried to ignore it, the nagging question lingered in the back of my mind: how long could I keep living this double life before everything came crashing down? The weeks that followed were a blur of secrecy and stolen moments. Sarah and I grew bolder, more comfortable in our clandestine arrangement, and I found myself increasingly dependent on her presence. She had become more than just an escape, she was my refuge, a safe space away from the emptiness I felt at home. At first, our meetings were infrequent, careful, and calculated. But as time went on, we took more risks. Sometimes, Sarah would come over to our house when Jack was away on business trips or working late at the office. The thrill of being together in the space I shared with my husband was both exhilarating and terrifying. There was always the chance that Jack could come home early or that a neighbor might notice something, but that only seemed to heighten the intensity of our relationship. One evening, Sarah came over after Jack had called to say he'd be working late again. He had been so engrossed in a big project at work that I barely saw him anymore, and when he did come home, he was always exhausted, too tired to do anything more than mutter a quick "good night" before collapsing into bed. That night, Sarah and I sat in the living room, a bottle of wine between us. The atmosphere was different, more intimate, more relaxed. There was no need to rush or to worry about being caught. We talked for hours, laughing about everything and nothing, and I realized how easy it was to be with her, how natural it felt. "I've missed this," I said, taking a sip of my wine. "I've missed feeling like this." "Like what?" Sarah asked, her eyes locked on mine. "Like myself," I admitted. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I lost who I was. I became Jack's wife and nothing more. But with you, I feel alive again." Sarah reached out and touched my hand, her thumb gently stroking the back of it. "You deserve to feel like that all the time," she said softly. "You deserve to be happy." Her words hit me hard, and for a moment, I felt a surge of guilt. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew that lying to Jack, betraying him like this, was unforgivable. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the truth of what Sarah had said. I did deserve to be happy, didn't I? After all the years of being ignored, of feeling like an afterthought in my own marriage, didn't I have the right to find joy wherever I could? We sat in comfortable silence for a while, our fingers intertwined. The house was quiet, save for the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. It was peaceful, almost surreal, and for the first time in a long time, I felt content. But as the night wore on, reality began to creep back in. The weight of what I was doing, of the lies, the deceit, started to press down on me. I pulled away from Sarah, standing up and pacing the room, my mind racing. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, concern etched across her face. "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. I don't know how long I can keep doing this. Lying to Jack, sneaking around, it's exhausting. And I can't help but feel like it's all going to blow up in my face eventually." Sarah stood up and crossed the room to where I was standing. She placed her hands on my shoulders, grounding me with her touch. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," she said gently. "But whatever you choose, I'll be here for you. I just want you to be happy." Her words were comforting, but they didn't solve the problem. I knew that eventually, I would have to make a choice. I couldn't keep living this double life forever. Sooner or later, something would have to give. The next day, Jack came home earlier than expected. It caught me off guard, he hadn't been home before midnight in weeks. He walked in, looking tired but surprisingly cheerful, and I realized that I hadn't even noticed the change in his mood lately. I had been so wrapped up in my own world with Sarah that I hadn't paid attention to Jack at all. "Hey," he said, leaning down to kiss me on the cheek. "I thought I'd surprise you by coming home early for once." I forced a smile, trying to act as if everything was normal. "That's nice," I said, feeling a pang of guilt. Jack sat down on the couch, stretching out and letting out a long sigh. "I've missed this," he said, almost echoing the words I had spoken to Sarah the night before. "It feels like we haven't spent any time together lately." I sat down next to him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It was true, Jack and I had been distant for a long time. But now, sitting here with him, I realized just how much had changed. I wasn't the same person I had been before Sarah. And the truth was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back to the way things were. Jack turned to me, his expression softening. "I know I've been busy with work," he said. "And I know I haven't been around as much as I should be. But I'm trying to make more time for us. I don't want you to feel like I'm neglecting you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For so long, I had been telling myself that Jack didn't care, that he had chosen his career over our marriage. But now, hearing him say this, I realized that maybe I had been wrong. Maybe Jack did care, maybe he had just been struggling to balance everything. But it was too late. I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had already let Sarah into my life, into my heart, and I wasn't sure if I could walk away from that now, even if Jack was trying to make things right. I appreciate that, I said, my voice soft. I really do. Jack smiled, pulling me into a hug. But as I rested my head against his chest, all I could think about was Sarah. How had I let it get this far? How had I ended up in this impossible situation? The days that followed were torturous. Jack's newfound efforts to reconnect only made things harder. Every time he tried to be affectionate or thoughtful, it reminded me of the lies I was living, the secret life I had built with Sarah. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to end things with her. She had become my anchor, my safe harbor, and I wasn't ready to let go. But I knew it couldn't last. The walls were closing in, and sooner or later, everything would come crashing down. In the days following Jack's offer of the getaway, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an emotional cliff. Jack was trying so hard to fix what he thought was a rough patch in our marriage, completely unaware of the real storm brewing beneath the surface. Every time he looked at me with those hopeful eyes, I felt like I was crumbling a little more inside. But as much as I wanted to believe things could be salvaged between us, my heart had already shifted. Sarah and I had grown closer in ways I couldn't have predicted. What started as an illicit affair born of attraction and curiosity had evolved into something deeper, more meaningful. She wasn't just a distraction from my marriage, she had become someone I confided in, someone who understood me in a way I hadn't been understood for a long time. Yet, that only made things more complicated. One evening, after another dinner with Jack where the conversation felt forced and strained, I texted Sarah. "I need to see you," I wrote. The weight of everything felt too heavy, and Sarah had become my only solace. Her reply came almost instantly. "Come over." I found myself making yet another excuse to Jack. I told him I had a late work meeting, something I knew he wouldn't question. He simply nodded, though I could see the hurt in his eyes. The lies were piling up, and even though Jack hadn't figured out the truth yet, I could feel his growing suspicion. But the thought of ending things with Sarah or coming clean to Jack was something I couldn't bring myself to face, at least not yet. When I arrived at Sarah's apartment, the tension in my chest immediately started to loosen. As soon as she opened the door, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, like I could finally breathe again. She pulled me into her arms, her embrace warm and familiar. "You seemed off in your texts," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "What's going on?" I sighed, letting my head rest on her shoulder. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." "Doing what?" Sarah asked, leading me over to the couch. "Hiding?" I nodded. "It's getting harder every day. Jack's trying so hard to make things better between us, but I just don't know how to tell him. I don't know how to break his heart." Sarah's hand rested on my leg, her touch gentle but firm. "You're not happy, and you deserve to be. Jack will be hurt, yes, but staying in a marriage where you're not truly invested isn't fair to either of you." Her words echoed the thoughts I had been battling for weeks. It wasn't fair to Jack, and it wasn't fair to me. But knowing that didn't make the decision any easier. "I don't want to lose you," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth. As complicated and messy as this whole situation was, I couldn't imagine my life without Sarah in it now. "You won't," she replied firmly. "But you can't keep living two lives. At some point, you're going to have to choose." Her words hung heavy in the air. I knew she was right. This balancing act I had been performing, trying to keep Jack happy while being with Sarah, was unsustainable. Something had to give. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted. Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "I'm not going to push you, but just know that I'm here, no matter what. And I'll wait as long as you need me to." Her patience, her kindness, it was what drew me to her in the first place. She wasn't pressuring me to make a decision, but I could see that it was weighing on her too. We couldn't keep sneaking around forever, and as much as I dreaded the idea of coming clean, I knew it was inevitable. I stayed with Sarah that night, the comfort of her presence soothing the storm inside me. But when I returned home the next morning, the weight of my double life felt heavier than ever. Jack was in the kitchen, making coffee, and for a moment, everything felt normal, like we were just a regular couple starting their day. But that illusion shattered the second he looked up at me. "You're home early," he said, a question lingering in his tone. "Yeah, the meeting didn't last as long as I thought," I lied, the words coming out too easily now. But Jack didn't seem convinced. He watched me closely, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. My heart skipped a beat. "About what?" Jack set down his coffee cup and crossed the room, standing in front of me. "I know something's been going on. You've been distant, secretive. I feel like I don't even know who you are anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This was it. The moment I had been dreading, the moment where the truth would come crashing down around us. "I just want to know what's going on," Jack continued, his eyes pleading. "If there's something I've done, if there's something you need, just tell me. We can work through it, but I can't fix what I don't understand." Tears welled up in my eyes. Jack wasn't angry, he wasn't accusing me. He was genuinely trying to fix whatever he thought was broken in our marriage. But the truth was, it wasn't something he could fix. It wasn't about him anymore. "I don't know how to say this," I began, my voice trembling. "But I haven't been honest with you." Jack's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something darker, something closer to fear. "What do you mean?" "I've been seeing someone else," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. And I'm so sorry, Jack." His face went pale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might explode in anger, but instead, he just stood there, staring at me in disbelief. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, knowing that this was the moment everything would change. There was no going back from this. "It's Sarah." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack's eyes widened, the shock of my confession hitting him like a freight train. He stumbled back, as if the weight of my words was too much for him to bear. "Sarah," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "My secretary? You're seeing my secretary?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Jack. I never wanted to hurt you. But the damage was already done." The moment Jack's eyes locked onto mine, I knew things would never be the same. His face was a mix of disbelief and betrayal, emotions swirling so intensely that I could almost feel the heat of them. The air between us grew thick, suffocating, and I struggled to find words that could soften the blow, but there was nothing left to say. I had crossed the line, and now the truth was out in the open. "Sarah? My secretary?" Jack repeated, his voice cracking as he tried to process it. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen like a man who had just discovered a secret too terrible to confront. "I trusted her. I trusted you." His words were daggers, slicing through the silence and into my heart. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about trust, that I never meant for things to spiral out of control, but none of that would matter now. The reality of the situation was too overwhelming, too raw. "I'm so sorry, Jack," I whispered, feeling my throat tighten. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It just..." "Just what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "It just happened? That's your excuse?" He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and pain. "You're telling me that my wife and my secretary have been sneaking around behind my back, and you expect me to believe that it just happened?" I winced, knowing how hollow my words sounded. Jack's reaction was expected, but the intensity of it made everything feel more real, more final. There was no going back now. I had shattered the life we built, and there was no way to repair it. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, the tears now spilling down my cheeks. "I've been confused, and things between us haven't been the same for a while." "Confused?" Jack's voice was incredulous. So instead of talking to me, you turned to her? You're telling me that our problems were so bad that you had to betray me like this? His words stung, each syllable a reminder of how far I had fallen from the person I used to be. I could see the devastation in his eyes, the betrayal etched across his face. But there was also a part of me that knew this conversation had been a long time coming. We had been drifting apart for months, maybe even years. And now, there was no more pretending. It wasn't just about our problems, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, she made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. I'm so sorry, Jack. Jack stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe this. I can't believe I didn't see it. I wanted to reach out to him, to say something that could ease the pain I had caused, but I knew nothing I said would make this any better. The truth was out now, and it was like a wrecking ball crashing through our marriage. I had done this. I had destroyed everything. You should go, Jack said suddenly, his voice cold and distant. I can't even look at you right now. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse under the weight of it all. But I knew he was right. I had no right to stay here, in the home we had built together, after what I had done. I'll pack a few things, I said quietly, my voice trembling. Jack didn't respond, his back turned to me as he stared out the kitchen window, lost in his own thoughts. The distance between us felt insurmountable now, and I knew that whatever love we had once shared was gone. I moved through the house in a daze, gathering a few essentials and stuffing them into a bag. Every room I passed was filled with memories, happy moments that now felt like ghosts haunting me. As I zipped up the bag and made my way to the door, I paused for a moment, glancing back at Jack one last time. I really am sorry, I said, my voice barely audible. Jack didn't turn around. He stood there, frozen in place, the weight of everything pressing down on him. And I knew that no matter what I said or did now, the damage was done. I stepped out of the house and into the cool night air, the reality of my situation sinking in with every step I took. I had nowhere to go, no clear plan in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to the life I had just left behind. I texted Sarah as I walked down the street, my fingers trembling. I told him. It's over. Her reply came quickly. Where are you? Do you need to come over? Part of me wanted to say yes, to run into her arms and forget about everything that had just happened. But another part of me knew that wouldn't fix anything. My life was unraveling, and I needed to figure out what came next on my own. I need some time to think, I typed, hitting send before I could change my mind. Sarah didn't reply, and I knew she understood. She always did. As I walked through the darkened streets, the weight of my actions pressed down on me harder than ever before. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. There was no going back, no undoing the hurt I had caused. And for the first time, I truly understood the cost of the life I had chosen. I found myself walking aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The night air was cold, biting through my thin jacket as I wandered the empty streets. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the guilt and regret that were now my constant companions. I ended up in a small park, sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp. The stillness around me only made the turmoil inside feel more unbearable. I replayed Jack's face over and over in my mind, the shock, the pain, the betrayal. It was an expression I would never forget, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. How had it come to this? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? I had been so consumed by the excitement, the rush of something new, that I had blinded myself to the destruction I was causing. I had lost sight of everything that mattered, my marriage, my integrity, my future. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from Sarah. Are you okay? I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears welled up in my eyes. I didn't know how to answer. Was I okay? No, I wasn't. I had shattered my life, hurt the person I once loved most, and now, standing at the edge of it all, I didn't know if there was any way back. Instead of responding, I turned off my phone and tucked it into my bag. I needed time to think, to figure out what my next step would be. Running to Sarah wouldn't solve anything, in fact, it would only complicate things further. I had to confront the reality of what I had done, alone. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. I rented a small room in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where I spent most of my time in a fog of numbness. I didn't go to work, I didn't see anyone. I just sat with my thoughts, replaying everything over and over again. Jack didn't reach out, and I didn't expect him to. I had left him with nothing but devastation, and I knew he needed space to process it all. But as the days dragged on, the weight of my choices became harder and harder to bear. One afternoon, while staring at the peeling paint on the motel wall, I decided to call him. I didn't know if he would answer, but I couldn't live with the silence any longer. I needed to know where we stood, even if it meant hearing that he never wanted to see me again. I dialed his number, my heart pounding in my chest as the phone rang. On the fourth ring, he picked up. "Hello?" His voice was cold, distant. I swallowed hard, trying to find my own. "Jack, it's me." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear him breathing, waiting. "What do you want, Emma?" His tone was emotionless, flat. I needed to talk to you. I know I have no right to ask, but can we meet? Just once. I need to say a few things." Another silence. I held my breath, waiting for his response, bracing myself for the rejection. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow. Noon. The cafe near the park." And then he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Tomorrow would be the hardest conversation of my life, but I owed it to Jack to face him one last time. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, my hands trembling as I gripped the cup of coffee in front of me. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching out like an eternity as I waited for Jack to arrive. I wasn't sure what I would say, or how he would react, but I knew I had to try. When he finally walked in, my heart skipped a beat. He looked different, thinner, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. It was clear that the last few weeks had taken their toll on him, just as they had on me. He sat down across from me without a word, folding his hands on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with everything left unsaid. "Thank you for coming," I said quietly, breaking the silence. He nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the table, refusing to meet mine. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," I began, my voice trembling. "But I wanted to apologize. For everything. For what I did, for the way I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Jack didn't respond right away. He sat there, his hands still folded, his face unreadable. "I loved you, Emma," he said finally, his voice low and filled with sadness. "I trusted you. I thought we were in this together. And then you, with her. It's like I don't even know who you are anymore." His words cut deep, but I knew they were true. I had broken that trust, and no matter how much I apologized, I couldn't undo the damage. "I don't know who I am anymore either," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "But I never stopped caring about you, Jack. I got lost, I made horrible mistakes, but it wasn't because I didn't love you." Jack finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and resignation. "I don't know if I can believe that," he said softly. "What you did, it broke something between us. And I don't think it can ever be fixed." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known this would be the outcome, but hearing it said out loud made it feel final. There was no more hope, no more chances. I had destroyed everything. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I just wanted to say goodbye. Jack stood up, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he turned to leave. I watched him walk away, knowing that this was the end. The life we had built together was gone, and all that remained were the shattered pieces of what once was. As I sat there alone in the cafe, I realized that this was the price of my choices, the loneliness, the regret, the emptiness. There was no undoing what had been done, no erasing the mistakes I had made. All I could do now was face the future, whatever it held, and hope that one day, I could find a way to forgive myself.